Have you ever thought that living near your children in old age could be the key to happiness? Many people believe that as we grow older, the closer we live to our family, the better care and companionship we will receive. The dream of being surrounded by loved ones, basking in their attention and affection, is something that brings comfort to many. But what if I told you that this very closeness, this desire for proximity, could actually lead to deeper suffering? In this video, we'll explore a question that might challenge everything you've believed about aging and family. Could living near your children in your later years actually be the biggest mistake of your life? Through the teachings of Zen and Buddhism, we'll delve into how attachment, even to those we love most, can be the root cause of our discontent and suffering. We'll also share a story that may just change the way you think about your old age and family connections. So sit back, relax, and let's reflect together on the wisdom that can help us navigate the later chapters of life with peace, freedom, and true contentment. Stay tuned, this could be the beginning of a profound shift in how you view the golden years ahead. If you find this insight valuable, don't forget to subscribe to Mindful Glow and hit the notification bell to never miss an update. Join our community as we explore life's deeper wisdom, one video at a time. Part 1. The desire for closeness. The elderly man had always taken pride in his role as the patriarch of the family. For decades, he had been the provider, the protector, the one his children turned to for guidance. His days were spent working tirelessly, his hands calloused from years of labor, and his mind constantly thinking of how to ensure a stable future for his loved ones. He poured his energy into raising his children, nurturing them through every milestone, from their first steps to their first jobs, believing that in return, they would be there for him when he needed them most. But now, in the quiet twilight of his life, he felt the weight of his sacrifices more keenly than ever. The once bustling house was now filled with only the echoes of the past. The walls, once alive with the sounds of children playing, now stood still. The laughter that had once filled every room seemed like a distant memory, fading as time marched on. His children, who had once clung to him as they navigated the complexities of life, had all grown up, found their own paths, and moved far away. His home, once a sanctuary of warmth and love, now felt like an empty shell, hollowed out by the absence of those he had once held so dear. As the seasons passed and the years grew long, the loneliness grew too. At first, it was a gentle whisper in the back of his mind, a feeling of something missing, something intangible. But soon, it became louder, more persistent. The emptiness inside him became impossible to ignore. He missed the sound of his children's voices, the laughter of his grandchildren, the bustle of family gatherings. The quietness of his days began to feel unbearable. In the silence, he could almost hear his own thoughts echoing back at him, thoughts he had long ignored in the busyness of his youth. It was then, in the midst of his solitude, that the idea began to form in his mind. What if he could live closer to his children? What if, by bringing them closer into his life, he could fill the void of loneliness that had settled so deeply in his heart? After all, he had spent his entire life making sure they had everything they needed, sacrificing his own happiness to see them succeed. Now, in his twilight years, he hoped that their proximity would offer the companionship and comfort that had eluded him for so long. At first, the idea seemed like a perfect solution. He imagined his children visiting often, perhaps living nearby. He pictured the joy of watching his grandchildren run to him with open arms, the laughter once again filling the air. The thought of having his family close by seemed to promise the warmth he so desperately craved. His heart swelled with hope as he envisioned the comfort of their presence, imagining that finally, His years of sacrifice would be rewarded with the closeness he had always dreamed of. And so, he made the decision. He moved closer to his children, hoping that this physical closeness would bring the emotional connection he so longed for. For a short time, it seemed like a dream come true. The visits came more frequently. His children made time to sit with him, and the grandchildren's laughter once again filled his home. There was joy in these moments. For a brief time, it seemed that everything was as it should be. His home once again felt full, vibrant, and alive. But, as the days turned into months, something began to shift. Slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, the visits grew less frequent. His children, though nearby, seemed busier with their own lives, their careers, their families, their responsibilities. These things began to take priority, and the time they had once spent with him began to dwindle. His grandchildren, too, grew older, their lives expanding beyond the confines of his home. They became more independent, less likely to rush over for a quick visit. The elderly man began to notice the subtle changes. At first, he told himself that they were just busy, that life had its ups and downs, and that things would pick up again. But as weeks turned into months, the visits continued to decrease, and the emptiness he had hoped to escape began to return. The quiet of his house, once filled with the promise of familial closeness, began to feel even more oppressive. What had once been a comforting presence now felt like a distant memory. The happiness he had expected from their proximity seemed to slip away, like sand through his fingers. He began to question what had gone wrong. He had made the decision to live near his children in the hope that it would bring him the joy and connection he had been missing. Yet, as the reality of their lives grew more distant from his own, he found himself wondering, was this what he had hoped for? Was this truly the solution to his loneliness? Or had he misunderstood what he needed? In the quiet moments, he reflected on what had brought him to this place. Had he simply been seeking the wrong thing? Was it possible that, by bringing his family physically closer to him, he had only created new expectations, ones that his children, with their own lives and obligations, could not meet? And, in his desire for connection, had he unknowingly pushed them away, setting up a cycle of disappointment and longing that could never truly be satisfied? As the days stretched on and the visits grew fewer, he began to realize that his longing for closeness, though deeply human, was not the simple solution he had believed it to be. The problem wasn't the physical distance between them, it was the emotional expectations he had attached to that closeness. In his desire for comfort, he had forgotten an important truth: proximity doesn't always lead to connection. And sometimes, the more we seek something from others, the more we risk pushing them away. Part 2: The Illusion of Happiness. At first, the elderly man felt a sense of joy and fulfillment that he had not experienced in years. The presence of his children, the laughter of his grandchildren, and the warmth of familiar faces seemed to fill the emptiness that had plagued him for so long. For a brief time, life felt full again. The days were brighter. The air seemed lighter. And he began to believe that perhaps this proximity, this closeness, was the answer to his years of loneliness. When his children visited, he would eagerly greet them at the door, his heart swelling with affection as he hugged them. The house would come alive with the sound of chatter, the children playing games, and the lively conversations that once defined his home. Even the simplest moments, sitting together at the dinner table or enjoying a cup of tea, felt like precious treasures. The joy of seeing his grandchildren run to him with open arms filled him with warmth. He thought to himself, "This is it. This is what I've been waiting for." But as the months passed, the visits became less frequent. At first, it was only a few days between calls, then a week, and soon it became 2 or 3 weeks before his children would drop by. The excuses were always gentle but clear: "I've got work," or "the kids have school activities," or "we're planning a family trip this weekend." His heart would sink each time, as he sat alone, waiting for the knock at the door or the phone call that never came. It wasn't just the visits that faded, it was the emotional connection that seemed to drift away. His children, though physically near, were increasingly absorbed in their own lives. The conversations grew shorter. The moments of togetherness grew more strained. He would watch them as they sat in his living room, absorbed in their phones, their attention divided between their own concerns and the polite obligation to spend time with him. His grandchildren, once eager to play, had grown older, more self-absorbed, and now preferred to stay with their friends or engage in their own activities. The warmth he had once felt was slowly replaced by an uncomfortable silence, a sense of disconnection. In these moments, the man felt the painful sting of abandonment. It wasn't that his children didn't love him, or that they were being intentionally neglectful, but the emotional distance was undeniable. He had expected that their physical proximity would bring the emotional connection he had so desperately craved. Yet, as they went about their lives, he found himself feeling like an outsider in his own family. His home, which had once been full of laughter and warmth, now felt more like a waiting room, waiting for something that never quite arrived. One afternoon, as he sat alone in his living room, the quietness pressing in around him, a thought surfaced in his mind. He had been so eager to have his children near him, believing that their presence would fill the emptiness he had long felt. But now, with their physical presence seeming to do little to ease his loneliness, he began to question everything. Why am I feeling this way? He wondered. I should be grateful that they're nearby. What more do I need? It was in this moment of deep reflection that he recalled the words of the Buddha. Words that had long ago been shared with him: attachment is the root of suffering. The realization hit him like a bolt of lightning, shattering the veil of illusion that had clouded his mind. He had attached his happiness to the presence of his family, to the idea that their proximity would bring him the peace and companionship he longed for. But in doing so, he had unknowingly bound his happiness to their actions, their decisions, their availability. And when those things didn't meet his expectations, his happiness crumbled. The truth was difficult to face. He had spent his life giving to his family, thinking that by securing their futures, by being there for them, he would one day be rewarded with their love and affection in his old age. But now he realized that in seeking happiness from others, he had relinquished control over his own joy. His happiness had become dependent on their visits, their attention, their presence. And when those things faded, so did his sense of fulfillment. This realization was both liberating and painful. It was liberating because it showed him the root of his suffering. He no longer had to wait for his children to fill the void within him. It was painful because it meant confronting the reality that his own happiness could not be outsourced. His longing for connection, for love, for companionship, these were his to carry, not his children's responsibility. And that was a heavy burden to bear. For the first time, the elderly man saw clearly how his attachment had led him to this point. He had mistaken the presence of his family for the solution to his loneliness, only to discover that their presence could not fill the emptiness inside him. In a way, his expectations had created a trap that held him hostage to a false hope that others could make him happy. And in that moment, he realized that the peace he sought could not be found in others. It had to come from within. This revelation set the stage for a profound shift in the elderly man's perspective. He began to understand that true happiness, true peace, was not something that could be found through the presence or actions of others. It was something that could only be cultivated within himself. The illusion of happiness that he had chased for so long began to fade. And in its place, a new understanding began to take root. Happiness, he realized, was not dependent on the presence of others, but on his own ability to find peace within himself. The man now saw that his happiness had always been within his own reach. He had only been looking in the wrong place. And though the pain of attachment still lingered, he knew that he had taken the first step toward freedom. He had let go of the illusion that his children could save him from his own loneliness. And with that, he could begin to heal, to find true contentment in the present moment, independent of the whims of others. Part 3. The weight of expectations. Bitterness began to seep into the elderly man's heart. Like a slow, insidious poison, he had spent his entire life giving his time, his energy, his dreams, all in service to his children's well-being. Every sacrifice, every moment of hardship, had been for them. He had worked tirelessly to provide, to raise them, to ensure they had every opportunity to succeed in life. His love for them was unconditional, and he believed that in return, when the time came, they would care for him with the same devotion. But now, as the years passed, he felt a deep sense of betrayal. His children, who had once been so dependent on him, had grown into adults with their own lives, their own families, and their own priorities. They no longer seemed to have the same urgency to spend time with him, to seek his guidance, or to share their lives with him. The visits became more sparse, the phone calls less frequent. The love he had once freely given seemed to be met with silence and distance. He found himself growing resentful, bitter even, at the thought that all his sacrifices might have been in vain. He couldn't help but think, I gave so much to raise them, and now they've forgotten me. Where's the love I was promised in my old age? His mind began to play with the idea of what he deserved. After all, he had been the one who had put his dreams aside for the sake of his children. He had been the one who had worked long hours, often sacrificing his own well-being for their future. Now, in his later years, he expected them to do the same for him, to care for him, to spend time with him, to give him the love and attention he had given so freely all those years. But the more he expected, the more his suffering grew. The disappointment began to weigh heavily on him, as though each unreturned call, each forgotten visit, added a stone to the pile of resentment he carried in his heart. Why weren't they here when I needed them? He thought. Why can't they see that I gave everything for them? The expectations he had placed upon his children became a burden, one that he carried with increasing difficulty. And the heavier the burden became, the more his bitterness grew, until it threatened to consume him entirely. One night, as he lay tossing and turning in his bed, sleep evading him, a dream began to unfold. It was vivid and clear. He found himself in a quiet, peaceful garden, bathed in soft moonlight. Sitting before him was a wise Zen master, his face serene, his posture perfect. The Zen master looked at him with deep understanding, as though he could see into the very depths of his soul. You are clinging to the idea that your children must fulfill your desires, the Zen master said, his voice calm yet powerful. The more you expect from them, the more you will suffer. True peace comes from within, not from others. The man blinked, stunned by the simplicity yet profundity of the words. It was as if a light had been turned on in the dark corners of his mind. For a moment, he could not speak. The truth of the Zen master's words resonated deeply, reverberating through him like the sound of a gong. He had been clinging to the idea that his children owed him something, that they should repay his sacrifices with care, love, and attention. He had attached his happiness to their actions, believing that they had a duty to make him feel valued and loved in his old age. But the Zen master's words cut through his attachment like a sharp blade. True peace comes from within, he thought, not from his children, not from their visits, their calls, or their attention. In that moment, the elderly man realized that his suffering didn't arise from his children's actions. It wasn't because they were neglecting him or failing to live up to his expectations. No, his suffering came from his attachment to those expectations, the belief that they should behave in a particular way, that they should act according to his desires. He had placed a heavy weight on them, a weight they could never truly bear. The more he clung to his expectations, the more the suffering piled up. And the more he suffered, the more he resented them for not fulfilling his hopes. The dream ended, but the wisdom of the Zen master's words lingered in his mind, echoing in the stillness of the night. The elderly man lay still in his bed, deep in thought. Slowly, a sense of clarity began to wash over him. The path to peace was not through others, it was through himself. The key to his happiness was not in the hands of his children, but in his own heart. He thought about all the years he had spent giving to others. And now, in his later years, he realized that it was time to give to himself, not in the form of material possessions or external validation, but through emotional freedom, freedom from the heavy weight of expectations. He began to understand that expectations were like chains, binding him to a reality that could never be fulfilled. The more he expected from his children, the more trapped he became in the cycle of disappointment and resentment. But if he could release those expectations, he could free himself from the emotional turmoil that had kept him bound. In that freedom, he could find peace, true peace, the kind that came from within. This was the beginning of a new understanding for the elderly man. It wasn't that he stopped loving his children, or that he stopped wanting their presence in his life, but he now saw that his love for them could not be tied to what they gave him in return. His happiness could no longer be dependent on their actions. It had to come from a deeper place within himself, one that was free of expectations, free of demands. The man knew that it would take time to fully internalize this truth, to fully let go of his attachment to his children's actions. But he also knew that this was the first step on the path to peace. And for the first time in many years, he felt a sense of relief, as though a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The realization was a turning point. It was the beginning of his journey toward true inner peace. And although the road ahead was still long, he now knew where to begin. Part 4: The Dangers of Dependence. The elderly man's dependency on his children began to grow insidiously, like a vine creeping up a tree, slowly tightening its grip. At first, his desire for their closeness seemed harmless. He simply wanted to feel loved and cared for in his later years. But as time passed, that desire morphed into something more, a profound emotional neediness that he couldn't escape. It wasn't just about having them nearby, it became a desperate hope that their visits, their words, their attention, would fill the deep, aching emptiness inside him. In the early days of moving closer to his children, there had been joy. The presence of his family had seemed to alleviate the solitude that had settled over him like a heavy fog. But now, each visit had begun to feel like a lifeline that he could never quite hold on to. The more he hoped for their company, the more the visits started to feel like obligations. He began to feel like he was not being seen for who he was, but rather as someone who needed constant care. His emotional dependency grew stronger with every passing day. And with it, his sense of independence began to fade. He would sit by the window for hours, waiting for a call, longing for a visit, hoping that his children would fill the space around him with warmth. But each time the phone rang and it wasn't them, or when days passed without a knock at his door, the emptiness deepened. He was no longer the man who had once been independent, strong, and self-reliant. Now, he was a man who needed others to make him feel whole. A man whose happiness seemed tied to their presence. It was in one of these moments of quiet desperation that he remembered an old Buddhist story his teacher had once shared with him. The story was about a man carrying a heavy sack of grain. The man had been walking for miles, and though others had offered to help him carry the load, he refused. "I must carry it alone," he insisted. "This burden will make me stronger." But despite his determination, the sack grew heavier and heavier with each step. The man's refusal to accept help only made his burden more unbearable. His belief that carrying the sack on his own would make him stronger was ultimately misguided. In reality, he was simply making his load heavier, and it was weighing him down in ways he could not yet understand. The story struck the elderly man deeply. He realized with startling clarity that he had been doing the same thing, though in a different form. He had been carrying the burden of emotional neediness, hoping that his children's visits, their attention, their care, would fill the void inside him. He had convinced himself that the more he relied on them, the more he would feel loved and validated. But in reality, by placing his emotional well-being entirely in their hands, he was making his burden heavier, not lighter. He was not becoming stronger. He was becoming weaker. This revelation was a difficult one. It forced him to confront the painful truth that his dependence on his children was not only damaging to his own sense of independence, but it was also placing an undue weight on them. They, too, had their own lives, their own struggles, their own responsibilities. And by leaning on them so heavily, he was not only draining his own emotional strength but also straining their relationship with him. The man sat in silence, the weight of the realization settling over him like a heavy fog. He had been so focused on his desire for emotional support that he hadn't seen how his dependency was hurting both himself and his family. By expecting his children to fulfill all his emotional needs, he had made himself vulnerable in ways that he hadn't realized. The more he needed them, the more distant they seemed. And the more distant they seemed, the more desperate his longing became. It was a vicious cycle that was pushing them away, rather than bringing them closer. But in that moment of deep reflection, the elderly man understood that true strength didn't come from relying on others. It came from within. He remembered the Buddha's teachings on detachment and self-reliance. And he began to realize that emotional independence wasn't about pushing people away. It was about no longer allowing his happiness to depend on others. It was about standing strong in his own heart, regardless of external circumstances. He had spent so much time seeking validation from his children that he had neglected the power within himself, the power to find peace, to find joy, and to find fulfillment without needing anyone else to complete him. The danger of emotional dependence, he now saw, was not just the burden it placed on others. It was the way it eroded his own sense of self. By relying on his children to fill the gaps in his heart, he had lost touch with the strength that had carried him through so many challenges in life. He had given away his power to others, and in doing so, he had weakened himself. The elderly man knew that the path forward would not be easy. It would require him to let go of his need for constant reassurance, to release the tight grip he had on his children's affection, and to rediscover his own inner peace. But he also knew that this was the only way to reclaim his emotional independence and to stop being a burden on those he loved. The Zen master's words echoed in his mind: true peace comes from within, not from others. The man understood now that his journey was not about seeking fulfillment from external sources. It was about looking inward, finding strength in his own heart, and learning to carry his emotional burdens with grace and self-reliance. As he sat in silence, a sense of calm began to wash over him. For the first time in a long while, He felt as though he could stand on his own, free from the heavy weight of dependence. And in that freedom, he found the first glimmer of the peace he had been seeking all along. Part 5. The Path to Inner Peace. The elderly man sat quietly in his favorite chair, the soft glow of the afternoon sun spilling through the window, casting a golden hue on the room. He had been meditating for hours, his mind wandering between the familiar thoughts of his children, the distant memories of their laughter, and the growing realization that had been settling within him over the past few weeks. Today, as the sun bathed him in its warm light, something shifted. He had been struggling for so long with the feeling of loneliness, the longing for his children's presence, that he had never truly taken the time to appreciate the quiet moments of his own life. But today, as his mind quieted, he experienced a deep moment of clarity. It wasn't his children's presence that had been the source of his suffering, it was his attachment to them. It was the idea that their visits, their attention, their love, would somehow fill the emptiness inside him. The Buddha's words, which he had heard so many times before, now struck him with full force. Peace comes from within, do not seek it without. The realization was simple, yet profound. His peace, his contentment, didn't depend on his children or their visits. It had never truly depended on them in the first place. His happiness had always been in his own hands, in the quiet moments of solitude, in the acceptance of life as it was. As the sunlight warmed his skin, the elderly man felt a deep sense of release. For so long, he had been holding on to the idea that his happiness lay outside of himself, that it lay in his children's actions, in their ability to give him the attention and companionship he craved. But now he understood that true contentment didn't come from others, it came from within. It was the acceptance of the present moment, the surrender of expectation, that brought inner peace. He sat still, letting the wisdom of this realization sink in. His eyes rested on the simple beauty around him, the soft rustle of leaves outside his window, the chirping of birds, the distant hum of the world outside. These were the moments he had ignored for so long, always preoccupied with his yearning for something more, for someone else. Yet, in this peaceful silence, he realized that these moments, the warmth of the sun on his face, the sound of birdsong, the stillness in his heart, were enough. They were everything he needed. His mind, once restless with thoughts of what was lacking, began to calm. The endless cycle of waiting for calls, of expecting visits, of measuring his worth by how often his family showed up, started to dissolve. He no longer felt a need to hold on to the past or constantly plan for the future. The present moment, with its simple pleasures, was enough. In that instant, the man understood the truth of the Buddha's teachings on detachment. It wasn't about pushing others away or rejecting the people he loved. It was about no longer allowing his peace to depend on them. It was about accepting them as they were, without the heavy weight of expectation, and finding contentment within himself, independent of external circumstances. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the fresh air that had entered through the open window. His body relaxed. His heart, once tight with longing and frustration, now felt light and free. He realized that the mistake wasn't in wanting to be close to his children. The mistake had been in attaching his happiness to their presence, in believing that he needed them to feel whole. As he continued to meditate, the man's mind began to shift. He no longer measured his happiness by the frequency of his children's visits or the attention they gave him. He had learned that true joy didn't depend on anyone else's actions, it came from within, from the peace he could cultivate in his own heart and mind. The world outside continued to turn. The birds continued to sing, and the warmth of the sun continued to shine on his face. But now, The elderly man was no longer waiting for anyone or anything to make him feel whole. He had found the peace he sought in the present moment. He had found it within himself. For the first time in years, he felt truly content. He no longer felt the need to seek happiness outside of himself. The love he had once sought from his children was now replaced by a quiet love for himself. He no longer saw his children's visits as a necessity for his happiness, but as a beautiful addition to the life he had already cultivated. He had come to understand that true contentment doesn't lie in the presence of others, but in the ability to find peace and joy within one's own heart. And in that moment, as the sun dipped lower in the sky and the world outside continued on its course, the elderly man felt a profound sense of gratitude. He was at peace. Finally, he was at peace with himself, with his life, and with the beautiful simplicity of the present moment. Part 6: The Freedom of Letting Go. As the man continued on his journey of self-reflection, a deep sense of freedom began to emerge within him. It was as if a heavy burden he hadn't even realized he was carrying had been lifted from his shoulders. In letting go of his attachment to his children, he had freed himself from the suffering caused by unmet expectations and the constant yearning for things to be different. For so long, his happiness had been entwined with their actions, with their visits, with their attention. But now, that need had dissolved, and with it, a profound sense of liberation filled the space once occupied by longing. The first sign of this freedom appeared in the way he interacted with his children. Before, when they came to visit, there was a silent pressure he had unconsciously placed on them, a pressure to fill the emptiness he felt inside. He had hoped that their presence, their affection, would heal the emotional void he had carried for so many years. But now, with his expectations released, he noticed something different. His children no longer came out of a sense of obligation or guilt. They visited him, not because they felt they had to, but because they genuinely wanted to. It was subtle at first, but over time, he saw the change. The visits became less strained. Conversations felt more natural, more relaxed. His children laughed and shared their lives with him freely, without the underlying tension of unspoken demands. And the man realized this was the gift he had longed for all along: authentic connection, born not from need or expectation, but from mutual respect and love. His relationship with them transformed. The distance that once existed between him and his children, both physical and emotional, began to shrink. But now, it was a space filled with understanding, not dependency. As he sat in his chair, reflecting on this change, he recognized that the freedom he had gained wasn't just about the shift in his relationship with his family. It was about the shift within himself. By releasing his need for external validation, he had freed himself from the shackles of constant expectation. No longer did he feel the anxiety of waiting for others to fulfill his emotional needs. He was learning to fill that space himself. The freedom of letting go of his attachment to others' actions allowed him to live fully in the present moment. He no longer found himself preoccupied with thoughts of the past or anxiously planning for the future. There was a deep stillness within him, a peace that came from accepting life as it was, without trying to control or manipulate it. He began to appreciate the simple beauty of the everyday, the way the light filtered through the trees in his garden, the aroma of tea as it steeped in his cup, the sound of his own breath, steady and calming. These were the moments that filled him now, and they were enough. Without the constant need for others to affirm his worth or provide him with companionship, he found joy in his own company. He took walks in the neighborhood, spent more time in his garden, and engaged in his hobbies without worrying about whether they would be enough for someone else. He learned to simply be. And in this being, he discovered a joy that was independent of anyone else's presence. The man also noticed that he was no longer attached to the outcome of his relationships. He didn't measure his happiness by how often his children visited or how they expressed their love for him. Instead, he embraced the unpredictability of life. His children might be busy, and their visits might be infrequent, but he had learned that his peace didn't depend on them. He accepted their lives, just as they were, and in doing so, he freed himself from the constant desire to change them or the situation. His heart became lighter with each passing day. One of the most profound shifts was that his children began to sense the change in him as well. They could see that he no longer looked to them for reassurance. His emotional stability was no longer dependent on their actions. This new energy was contagious, and they responded with greater warmth and affection. They began to show up more often, but now it was out of genuine love, not because they felt obligated. Their visits were no longer a source of stress or expectation, but a joyful sharing of time together. The elderly man's freedom also came with a deeper sense of gratitude. He began to appreciate not only the moments of peace he had cultivated, but also the relationships that had once caused him so much distress. He had learned that true freedom was not about control or perfection. It was about embracing imperfection, accepting life's fleeting nature, and allowing everything to unfold without trying to force it into a shape that suited his desires. As the man continued his life, he felt more and more at ease. He wasn't seeking validation from anyone anymore, nor was he waiting for others to fulfill his emotional needs. In releasing his attachment to others, he had found a deep well of inner strength that had been with him all along. He had come to understand that the more he let go, the more freedom he gained. And it was this freedom, this ability to be content with whatever life brought, that had allowed him to experience true peace for the first time in many years. The relationships in his life became lighter, filled with love but not burdened by expectations. His children visited not because they had to, but because they loved him and wanted to share time with him. And in that simplicity, in that freedom from attachment, the elderly man found a deep sense of peace. He had finally come to understand that letting go wasn't about giving up. It was about freeing himself to experience life as it truly was: beautiful, imperfect, and deeply fulfilling. Part 7: The Lesson of Impermanence. The elderly man's journey of self-reflection brought him to a deeper understanding of one of the most profound and central teachings of Buddhism: impermanence. He had lived much of his life in the belief that certain things, his relationships, his family, his role as a father, were permanent fixtures that defined who he was. But as the years passed, and as he slowly began to release his attachment to those roles, he saw clearly that life, in its essence, is a constant state of flux. Nothing remains the same. Everything changes, and everything eventually fades away. In the earlier stages of his life, he had been the central figure in his children's world. They relied on him for everything, from the guidance he offered to the comfort of his presence. But now, his children were grown, living their own lives, creating their own families, and pursuing their own dreams. They no longer needed him in the same way. This shift, though natural, had left him feeling as though his place in the world was slipping away, like a river flowing past without waiting for him to keep up. For a long time, he had resisted this change, clinging to the idea that his role as a father should remain unchanged, even as the world around him evolved. He wanted the closeness he had once shared with his children, the role he had played in their lives, to endure forever. But as he sat quietly one evening, reflecting on his life and the changes that had taken place, the man began to realize the wisdom in accepting impermanence. It was the nature of life to change. He had resisted it for so long, fighting against the natural ebb and flow of time. But he now understood that to resist change was to resist life itself. His children's independence, their separation from him, was not a loss but a natural part of their own journeys. They had grown, and it was his turn to do the same. With this understanding, the man finally let go of his need for things to stay the same. He stopped clinging to the past, stopped wishing that his children were still the young, dependent beings they once were. Instead, he began to embrace the beauty of their transformation, just as he embraced the changes in his own life. The wisdom of impermanence allowed him to find peace in knowing that nothing, not even the most cherished moments, lasts forever. The dependence his children once had on him had naturally evolved, and with it, his role as a father had changed too. Rather than grieving the loss of that connection, he began to feel a quiet sense of gratitude for the experiences and memories they had shared. He realized that their independence wasn't a rejection of him, it was a sign of their growth, a testament to the love and care he had given them. In the same way, he came to understand that the closeness he had longed for in his later years would not remain forever either. His desire for constant companionship, for his children to always be near, had once been so strong that it had shaped much of his thoughts and actions. But he now saw that this longing, like all desires, was transient. His children's lives, his own life, and the very nature of the world around him were in constant motion. Nothing, not even the love he shared with his family, was permanent. This realization was liberating. It freed him from the burden of trying to hold on to something that was meant to change. He no longer tried to force his children into the roles he had once known them to occupy. Nor did he expect his relationship with them to be frozen in time. He understood that true peace came not from holding on to things, but from letting them flow, just as they were meant to. The impermanence of life was not a cause for sadness or fear, it was an invitation to live fully in the present, to appreciate the fleeting moments, and to accept the natural rhythm of life as it unfolded. The wisdom of impermanence allowed him to see his relationships differently. He no longer measured his happiness by how often his children visited or how much time they spent with him. He began to appreciate the quality of their connection, not the quantity. He recognized that life was not about accumulating moments, but about experiencing each one fully, without attachment to whether it would last. Each moment, each interaction, each shared experience was precious because it was temporary, and that temporality made it all the more valuable. He realized that the true lesson of impermanence wasn't about resignation, it was about acceptance. It was about understanding that change was the essence of life, and that by embracing it, he could find peace, his children's independence, his own aging process, and the passing of time were all natural parts of the journey. The love they shared didn't need to be constant and formed to remain powerful. It simply needed to be present. And in that presence, there was infinite beauty. In his acceptance of impermanence, the man also found freedom. He no longer sought to control or hold on to the moments that had passed, nor did he fear the changes that lay ahead. Instead, he learned to savor the present, to find joy in what was, without needing it to stay the same. The beauty of life, he now understood, lay not in its permanence, but in its fleeting nature. The more he embraced this truth, the more peace he found. As he sat quietly in his garden, watching the flowers bloom and fade with the seasons, he felt a deep sense of connection, not just to his children or his family, but to the very flow of life itself. He had finally come to understand that nothing lasts forever, and that was the greatest gift of all. For in the impermanence of life, he discovered the freedom to live fully, to love without clinging, and to find peace in the knowledge that every moment was enough, just as it was. Part 8. Finding Joy in Solitude. Through the process of letting go, the elderly man began to experience a profound shift in his perception of solitude. For much of his life, He had viewed solitude as something to be avoided, equating it with loneliness and isolation. The absence of his children's presence in his daily life had left him feeling abandoned at first. But now, as time passed, he started to see solitude in a different light. He discovered that solitude was not an absence of companionship, rather, it was a space of quiet reflection and peace. For the first time in years, he could hear his own thoughts clearly without the constant distractions of family dynamics and obligations. It was as if, in releasing his attachment to external sources of happiness, he had created room within himself for something deeper and more lasting. One crisp morning, as he sipped tea by the window, watching the early rays of the sun spread across the sky, he realized that this simple moment brought him a quiet joy. The warmth of the tea, the soft light filtering through the trees, and the gentle hum of the world outside, these were small things, but they filled him with a sense of contentment. He no longer rushed to fill the silence with noise or expectation. Instead, he embraced the stillness, savoring the peace that came with it. In his garden, another place he had once tended in a rush to keep up with the demands of daily life, he now found a deep sense of connection to nature. The slow, rhythmic work of planting, pruning, and watching the seasons change became a form of meditation for him. There was no hurry, no pressure, just the joy of being present with the earth, feeling the soil between his fingers, and witnessing the quiet miracle of life unfolding, one small leaf at a time. His time in solitude also deepened his relationship with himself. For years, his identity had been shaped by his role as a father, provider, and caregiver. But now, in his quiet moments alone, he began to rediscover who he was beyond these roles. He no longer had to be anyone for anyone else. He could simply be. And in this being, he found a sense of wholeness that had eluded him for much of his life. The need for validation or attention from others began to dissipate as he realized that he was enough, just as he was. His thoughts turned off into meditation, a practice he had once dismissed as impractical in the hustle and bustle of family life. But now, in the silence of his home, he took to sitting for short sessions each day. At first, his mind would wander, pulled by worries and desires. But over time, he learned to gently guide his focus back to his breath, back to the present moment. In those moments of stillness, he felt a deep sense of connection to something larger than himself, a quiet peace that transcended the chaos of everyday life. His children's visits, once so necessary for his happiness, began to take on a different significance. He no longer relied on them to fill the void inside him. Instead, their presence became a welcome addition to his life, a beautiful experience to be savored in its own right. He no longer expected them to provide him with a sense of meaning or fulfillment. Their visits were no longer a necessity, but a gift, an opportunity to share time together, to create new memories, without the pressure of needing them to make him happy. In this shift, his relationship with his children deepened in a way that felt more genuine and less burdened by expectations. The joy of solitude was not the absence of connection, it was the freedom to connect with himself in a way he had never done before. It was the ability to savor his own company, to listen to the whispers of his heart, and to find contentment in the simplicity of life's fleeting moments. In solitude, he found a deep well of inner peace, a quiet joy that didn't depend on the presence of others. It was a joy that came from within, rooted in acceptance and a profound sense of gratitude for the life he had lived and the life that was still unfolding. Solitude became, for the elderly man, a sanctuary, a space where he could fully embrace the impermanence of life, without fear or regret. It was in these moments of solitude that he discovered the truest form of happiness, the kind that doesn't depend on external circumstances. but on the peaceful acceptance of the present moment. The joy he found in solitude was not lonely, it was full, rich, and complete. And in this joy, he realized that he had never truly been alone. He had only been waiting for himself. Part 9. The Wisdom of Non-Attachment. As time passed, the elderly man's understanding of non-attachment deepened. The more he reflected on his life, the more he realized that his previous suffering had stemmed from his attachment to people, expectations, and outcomes. He had once clung to the hope that his children would always be there for him, that their visits would fill the emptiness he felt inside. But as he practiced the wisdom of non-attachment, he began to see that the very thing he had sought, peace and happiness, was never dependent on anyone or anything outside of himself. At first, he noticed small shifts. When his children couldn't visit as often as he had hoped, instead of feeling hurt or resentful, he felt a sense of acceptance. The feeling of disappointment that had once overshadowed his heart now seemed to dissolve as he learned to let go of his expectations. He realized that life didn't owe him the fulfillment of his desires, and that was perfectly okay. Each moment, whether filled with the laughter of family or the silence of solitude, was enough. Non-attachment, he discovered, didn't mean detachment or indifference. It was the ability to experience life fully without holding on to the need for things to be a certain way. It was freedom from the mental chains of desire and expectation. The elderly man began to see that his previous yearning for his children's attention was not a reflection of love, but rather a sign of his own inner longing and insecurity. By letting go of the need for his children's presence to complete him, he discovered that his love for them was deeper and purer, free from the clutches of need. He began to look at life with a greater sense of openness. When things didn't go as planned, he no longer reacted with frustration or anger. Instead, he greeted each moment with equanimity, understanding that everything, joy, sorrow, pleasure, pain, is transient. Like the seasons, life constantly changes, and it was in this very flux that peace could be found. His happiness no longer depended on the fixed patterns he had once hoped for. It was rooted in his ability to be present with what was, not what he wished it to be. The elderly man also noticed how his relationship with his children transformed. Instead of feeling hurt when they were unable to visit, he found himself genuinely happy when they did. Their visits were no longer laden with expectation or pressure. He no longer looked to them to fill the gaps in his life. Instead, their time together became something to be cherished for its own sake. He was no longer emotionally dependent on their presence to feel whole. This shift in his mindset created a new kind of bond, a bond based on mutual respect and love, rather than obligation or unspoken demands. He had come to see that non-attachment did not mean he had to sever ties with those he loved. It meant he could love them freely, without clinging to them or imposing his expectations on them. His heart had become spacious, open to giving love without expecting anything in return. He realized that true love, in its purest form, was not about seeking validation or fulfillment from others. It was about offering love freely, without conditions, and finding joy in the simple act of giving. In the quiet moments of his life, the elderly man experienced a deep sense of freedom. He no longer felt weighed down by the burden of unmet desires. He had liberated himself from the chains of expectation and had learned to find peace in the flow of life, in its ever-changing nature. This newfound freedom was not something external, it was an internal transformation. It was the liberation of the heart and mind from the illusion that happiness depends on anything outside of oneself. As the elderly man practiced non-attachment, he noticed how the emotional turmoil that had once dominated his life began to fade. He no longer felt the sharp pangs of frustration when his children were busy with their own lives. He no longer held on to the fleeting moments of happiness, trying to make them last forever. Instead, He learned to savor life as it came, without trying to control or possess it. Each moment, whether joyful or sorrowful, was experienced in its fullness, without the need for attachment to its outcome. Through non-attachment, the elderly man discovered that he had gained more than he had ever hoped for. He had found a peace that was not dependent on the actions or presence of others. It was a peace that was rooted in his ability to accept the impermanence of life, to embrace each moment without fear of losing it. He had become free, not by holding on to what he thought he needed, but by letting go of his need to control and possess. He had learned the profound wisdom of non-attachment, that happiness and peace are not found in external circumstances, but in the freedom of the heart to love without expectation, to experience life without clinging, and to find contentment in the present moment. By letting go, he had gained the greatest gift of all, freedom from suffering, and the deep peace that comes from knowing that all is as it should be. Part 10. The Full Circle of Life. In the later years of his life, the elderly man found himself at a profound turning point, where the lessons he had learned over the decades began to coalesce. His journey had, in many ways, come full circle. When he was young, his role as a father had been all-consuming. He had cared for his children, tended to their needs, and dedicated himself entirely to their well-being. His life had revolved around ensuring their happiness and success. But now, with the passage of time, the dynamic between him and his children had shifted. Where once he had been the caregiver, he had now become the one who needed care. Yet, in this later stage of life, his sense of duty had evolved. He no longer saw his children's care as something to fill a void inside of him or as a repayment for all his sacrifices. Instead, he understood that they were now adults with their own lives to lead. The relationship between them had changed, not out of any fault or falling out, but simply as part of the natural cycle of life. His children were no longer dependent on him in the way they once had been, and this realization brought him a deep sense of peace. His role as a father had transitioned into something more profound. He was no longer just a caretaker. He had become a wise elder, a living testament to the passage of time and the wisdom it carries. He no longer sought to shape his children's futures or dictate their paths. Instead, he shared his knowledge, offering guidance when needed, but always with the understanding that his children had their own journeys to walk. The love he had for them remained, but it was no longer a love rooted in need or expectation. It was a love that recognized their independence, celebrated their growth, and embraced the fluidity of their lives. In this new phase, the elderly man found that he had a responsibility not only to his children but also to himself. He had spent much of his life focused on the well-being of others, his family, his community, but now he realized that his own care was equally important. He had spent so much time providing for others that he had neglected his own emotional and spiritual growth. Now, in his later years, he dedicated himself to nurturing his own soul. He returned to the practices of meditation, mindfulness, and self-reflection, creating a space where he could continue to evolve and grow. In doing so, he discovered that the greatest gift he could offer to his children was not just his wisdom, but his example of self-care and inner peace. His children, though busy with their own lives, continued to love him deeply. They visited him, not out of obligation, but because they genuinely wanted to. The dynamic between them had shifted, but it had not diminished. Instead of coming to him for advice out of necessity, they came with gratitude and respect, knowing that he had lived through experiences they had yet to face. The relationship had transformed into one of mutual respect, love, and understanding. As he sat in his home, watching the seasons change, the elderly man marveled at the beauty of impermanence. He had learned that the passage of time was not something to fear, but something to embrace. Life, he now understood, was not about clinging to the past or trying to hold on to moments forever. It was about accepting change, allowing oneself to grow, and finding peace in the process. He no longer saw his later years as a time of decline or loss. Instead, he saw them as a time of blossoming. The wisdom he had accumulated over the years had become his greatest treasure. He was no longer concerned with the things he could no longer do or the time that had passed. What mattered now was the legacy he could leave behind, not in the material sense, but in the love and wisdom he shared with those around him. And so, the elderly man walked through his final years with grace, acceptance, and deep contentment. He had learned that life was not a linear journey but a circular one, where each phase held its own beauty and purpose. The circle of life had returned to where it had begun. But now he was not just the giver of care. He was also the receiver of love and respect in equal measure. In this final chapter of his life, the elderly man found a deep sense of fulfillment, not because he had reached some ultimate destination, but because he had learned to live fully in each moment. He had learned to let go of attachments, to accept the impermanence of all things, and to embrace the freedom that came with living without expectation. And as he looked back on his life, he could see that each moment, each phase, had been a valuable part of his journey. The full circle of life had brought him to a place of peace. He had given his love and care to his children, and in return, they had given him their love and respect. But more importantly, he had learned to love himself, to care for his own soul, and to find joy in the solitude and stillness that had once felt so foreign to him. In the end, it wasn't the presence of others that defined his happiness, but his ability to find peace within himself. And that, he knew, was the greatest gift of all. As the elderly man approached the final chapter of his life, a deep and unwavering peace settled within him. He looked back at his journey, not with regret, but with a quiet sense of fulfillment. His relationship with his children had transformed over the years, not because they spent more time together, but because he had released the need to control how things should be. He had let go of expectations and embraced the natural flow of life. In doing so, he found a profound sense of contentment that had nothing to do with the physical presence of others. He had come to understand that the key to happiness was not in clinging to the people around him or expecting them to fill the void in his life. True happiness lay in his ability to find peace within himself. He no longer felt the emptiness that once gnawed at him, for he had cultivated an inner calm that didn't depend on external circumstances. His greatest gift was not the love of his children, though he cherished that deeply, but the quiet wisdom of knowing that happiness is self-generated. In the final moments of his life, the elderly man felt no fear. He had lived fully, not attached to outcomes or dependent on others. His children, though they had their own lives, loved him dearly. They were not his source of happiness, but they were a beautiful part of his journey. He had learned that life is not about how much you hold on to, but how gracefully you can let go. The story of the elderly man offers a timeless lesson. True happiness, especially in old age, doesn't come from living close to our children or depending on others for emotional support. It comes from releasing attachment, practicing non-dependence, and finding peace within our own hearts and minds. As the Buddha so wisely said, "You yourself must strive. The Buddhas only point the way." True happiness is not something to be found in others, but in our own inner world. Thank you for watching this video. I hope it has inspired you to reflect on the nature of attachment and the path to true happiness in old age. If you found this video valuable, please consider subscribing to Mindful Glow for more content that explores wisdom and mindfulness. Leave a comment below and share your thoughts. I'd love to hear from you. See you in the next video.